It's September 2015 and Prime Minister Tony Abbott sits down with his Social Services Minister Scott Morrison. Earlier in the year, Abbott had survived a leadership spill, but it was humiliating as 39% of the Liberal Party voted for no leader in place of him. It was clear that Rome was falling, and in a last-ditch ploy to prevent the spill, Abbott offered Scott Morrison the most coveted ministerial position. In an act of great integrity, Morrison declined the post so that he wouldn't betray the existing Treasurer Joe Hockey, and then on top of that declared he'd still support Abbott against Turnbull. Except, according to Turnbull, that's only what happened on the surface. Allegedly, the one who engineered the February spill motion was Morrison himself. And though he'd declared his support for Abbott, really, he'd been helping Turnbull gain numbers by having his guys vote for Turnbull. As Turnbull emerged victorious, Morrison was given a reward for his covert operations, the Treasury. Unfortunately for Malcolm, he'd well and truly built his house upon sand. So I have a vivid memory of Malcolm Turnbull coming to power. It was the night before my last day of year 12, and I distinctly remember a guy at my fridge coming up to me and drunkenly telling me how good it was to have a Prime Minister who cared about climate change and innovation. And that was a pretty universal feeling across the country. Abbott the dinosaur was gone, and now we had a silver fox who was going to move us into the 21st century. And that was certainly how Turnbull wanted to portray himself, as in the courtyard of Parliament he said that the nation needed leadership that respected the intelligence of Australians. Now, when Turnbull came to power, they had about a year until the latest the 2016 election could be held. Despite the Libs having 90 seats to Labor's 55, the polls indicated that Abbott had made the Libs so unpopular that Shorten's Labor was well and truly in the hunt for the 2016 election. Turnbull had brought those polls back up, but this was likely to wane over the course of the year. Instead, Turnbull could get an earlier election by triggering a double dissolution, essentially dissolving both houses of Parliament and having every position up for re-election because the Senate refuses to pass a bill. You see, the Libs only held 33 out of 76 Senate seats and so had to work with parties like Palmer United, the Liberal Democrats, and even the Greens to get laws through Parliament. Much to the Senate's dismay, in early 2016, Turnbull tried to revive a Howard policy, the Australian Building and Construction Commission. The ABCC was part of Howard's deeply unpopular work choices reforms, which took power away from the workers and towards the employer, and the ABCC limited the activity of unions on construction sites. Turnbull paraded the fact that this increased productivity by 20%, but no one really knew where he was pulling that figure from. The only report that claimed it caused productivity growth was one from 2007 conducted by Ecotech, and even that was ordered to be dismissed by Federal Judge Murray Wilcox for faulty data collection. On top of that, it had received $250 million from Howard's government and only prosecuted 29 cases of illegal union activity on construction sites. However, all of those 29 charges were dropped for lack of evidence. The ABCC also saw a 37% increase in construction deaths as union reps were forbidden from inspecting the safety of sites, and when it was abolished in 2012, those death figures went back down. Understandably, the Senate struck down the bill twice. However, Turnbull put it forward a third time to trigger a double dissolution and an election in July. And so this begs the question, why on earth would Turnbull stake an election on this? It's not a sexy climate change reform, it's not funding to science and innovation. Why on earth would he stake it on a construction site reform that was proven to be ineffective? Well, as he actually notes in his book, yes, I listened to it on double speed, the Liberal Party struggled for donations in this election cycle, so much so that Turnbull stumped up $1.75 million of his own dollars. As much as Turnbull spoke of the need for increased productivity in a changing world, the cynic would argue that he really needed to keep property developer dollars coming through. And so Turnbull went into the 2016 election with his famous campaign slogan of jobs and growth, and rather than focus on climate change and innovation, his main focus in dethroning Abbott, he campaigned on having a more productive economy with less red tape. Firstly, the new Treasurer Scott Morrison suggested raising the GST to 15%. After repeated budget deficits, this would have helped the Libs work towards a surplus by increasing revenue, without of course taxing their donors. In fact, this would have been 4 times the size of the carbon tax, and that tax would have been paid by ordinary Australians rather than large corporations. Turnbull also pushed for the privatisation of TAFE and cut $650 million from Medicare. On top of that, Morrison and Turnbull also offered $1,000 to every business that hired an intern. Again, this was marketed as boosting youth employment, but just stop and think about it for a second. Is that not effectively incentivising companies to replace their workforce with, well, corporate serfs? On top of this, Turnbull had to deal with personnel issues. The seat of Macarthur had been rezoned to now be notionally a Labour seat by 0.5%. A lot of these Liberal voters were now in the Hume district, which was held by Angus Taylor and was very safely Liberal. Macarthur's Liberal member, Russell Matheson, wanted to resign from Macarthur and challenge for pre-selection in Hume, which he was very confident of winning. However, Turnbull intervened and persuaded him to fight for Macarthur, and of course Taylor was beyond relieved with this outcome, and Turnbull believed that this would forever ensure his loyalty. Turnbull was wrong. Shorten's campaign also gained a lot of traction, particularly playing into fears around Medicare cuts, to which Turnbull called it a Mediscare. On election night, so many seats were close calls that it was actually unclear who was going to win. Turnbull addressed a deflated crowd, saying he was confident of forming government, and Turnbull's instinct proved to be correct, as the Libs ended up beating Labour 76 seats to 69. That being said, the Libs lost 14 seats in the process and lost 3 in the Senate. However, having retained government, the Senate agreed to pass the ABCC, and Turnbull could begin his deregulation drive. On top of this, in early 2017, the Fair Work Commission reduced Sunday penalty rates by 25%, which cost workers up to $6,000 per year. Shorten blamed Turnbull for having his Minister for Unemployment, Michaelia Cash, stack the commission with Liberal Party goons, while Turnbull blamed Shorten for instituting the penalty rates in the first place back when he was Minister for Employment in 2013. Now again, Turnbull was the sexy Liberal leader who was forward-thinking, right? Well, his funding record would say otherwise. When it came to climate change, he didn't really change anything from the Abbott era. In fact, the Liberal Party's 26 to 28% emissions reduction target was instituted by Abbott, and he kept Abbott's $2.55 billion emission reductions fund. On top of this, Scott Morrison rebuffed any carbon pricing attempt like a carbon tax or an emission trading scheme, and Turnbull's Minister for the Environment, Greg Hunt, said that Labor's 15-year plan to transition to 50% renewable energy, a modest target compared to other nations, was going to cause power prices to skyrocket. But still, there's more. $3 billion were cut from departments related to climate change, including $500 million from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. These science cuts also saw 20% of CSIRO scientists lose their jobs, many of which then went to countries like Germany and France, and to add to that, some scientists that specialised in battery storage technology took their research to Tesla, a foreign company that we get no tax revenue from, as they then used that technology to sell Teslas back to us. And when it comes to science and innovation, there's still more. In 2015, Turnbull commissioned the Watt Report, which had a central finding that research needed to be directed into commercial outcomes, i.e. stay away from marine conservation and into gas drilling technology. I mean, that's really stuff that gas companies should do themselves, but hey, Turnbull's drive for innovation saw money taken away from climate change research and the remaining resources funneled into helping their donors. Now, another interesting piece of Turnbull's legacy was that Turnbull, the ex-merchant banker of all people, was the one who called for a royal commission into the banking sector. Now, what's more interesting is the way that he talks about it in his book. According to Turnbull, he believed that a royal commission into the banking sector was an ineffective solution into banks effectively money laundering, and that Shorten only put it on the agenda to have a sexier campaign policy in 2016. The more cynical view is that the Libs were anticipating electoral defeat in 2019 and wanted to have their donors investigated on their terms rather than by Labour. I fall somewhere in the middle. Turnbull certainly didn't want the commission, that much was public knowledge, but the Nationals were really annoyed with him for the gay marriage plebiscite. Banks were only really Liberal donors and certainly not rural National donors, and so they threatened to cross the floor to side with Labour and the Greens and force a commission. I should also add that the banks were very supportive of the plebiscite for advertising reasons. Take Gay NZ for example. And so the Nats also blamed the banks for gay marriage. Eventually, Turnbull gave in and at the end of 2017 announced a royal commission into the banking sector, which would go on to find some pretty horrendous practices, but that's for next video. In early 2018, Turnbull was also forced to deal with some more personnel issues. Though working in coalition, there was obviously no love lost between the Libs and the Nats over the plebiscite and the Royal Commission. At the end of 2017, Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce announced he'd separated from his wife, and then in 2018 it was reported that Joyce was expecting a child with his staffer, Vicky Campion. However, Turnbull used all of his influence as Prime Minister to force Joyce to resign. Firstly, he rewrote the Parliamentary Code of Conduct to forbid relationships with staffers, and then secondly, he forced Joyce to go on a week of personal leave while he was in America so that Joyce couldn't be acting Prime Minister. He then publicly called for Joyce to reconsider his position, and Joyce caved into the pressure, resigning as Deputy Prime Minister and Nationals leader, but joining Tony Abbott in those who had a grudge against the PM. The next personnel issue of 2018 had nothing to do with Parliament. It was with Steve Smith. So everyone in Australia remembers Sandpapergate. Effectively, a vice captain, David Warner, talked a junior player, Cameron Bancroft, into illegally scratching the ball with sandpaper so that it could reverse swing against South Africa. The captain, Steve Smith, walked by as this was happening and said that he didn't want to know about it. As you remember, Bancroft got caught and Steve Smith went to the press apologising and taking responsibility for it. Rather unhelpfully, Turnbull then used this as an opportunity to grandstand and called a press conference where he said the scandal was a shocking affront to Australia. Well, happy to use the darkest moment of a guy's career as an opportunity for good PR, when Gladys Berejiklian said the same thing
I don't need to know about that bit.
to her boyfriend engaging not in scratching a ball but in criminal corruption, Turnbull pulled out that she fell in love with the wrong guy line. In July, there was yet another issue for Turnbull. So this seat right here in Queensland is called Longman, and following the resignation of Labor MP Susan Lamb, there was a by-election. Polling data suggested that the Libs would likely win the seat, and so Turnbull pounced, calling it a referendum on whether the nation preferred his or Shorten's leadership. Unfortunately for Turnbull, it backfired massively as Labor held Longman with a further swing away from the Liberal vote. By his own metric, Australia was preferring Shorten as leader. Of particular note, One Nation gained a huge surge in votes, suggesting that Turnbull was alienating the cultural right of the party. As 2018 progressed, the knife started to come out for Turnbull, and it would only take one misstep for his government to come falling down: the National Energy Guarantee. Essentially, throughout Turnbull's years in office, the price of energy had consistently risen. As the climate change liberal, Turnbull used this as an opportunity to promote emissions reduction targets using the stick rather than the carrot. So basically, the plan removed subsidies and positive incentives for businesses to reduce their emissions, and instead, electric power companies needed to guarantee emissions reductions targets. Should these companies fail to meet those targets, Turnbull's government may have the power to deregister them as power providers, though this was kept fairly open. Of course, that renewable energy was even mentioned was controversial in of itself, and the member for Dixon, the one next door to Longman, moved on Turnbull. He, of course, is Peter Dutton. Dutton argued that the Longman election revealed that the Libs needed to move to the right and not to the left to avoid alienating its base. As talks of a leadership spill grew, Turnbull backed down and removed the emissions reductions targets from the National Energy Guarantee. Dutton publicly claimed to support Turnbull, though he was secretly acquiring votes for a spill. Helping him, of course, was the aggrieved Tony Abbott, who called Turnbull's compromise a conversion of convenience. According to Turnbull, Abbott was hoping Dutton would become leader, knowing he'd lose in 2019, and then Abbott could become opposition leader. In his book, Turnbull also wrote about a meeting he had with Rupert Murdoch and Kerry Stokes, the owner of the Seven Network. Apparently, Murdoch not only seemed sympathetic to the idea of Abbott for opposition leader, but allegedly said that a term of Labor wouldn't be that bad. To that, Stokes seemed to be horrified. Again, more evidence that the left-right divide is a pure media invention. But as pressure grew, Turnbull allowed a leadership challenge, very confident that he could strike down Dutton before he gained any more momentum. With his loyal treasurer by his side, Turnbull and Morrison gained 48 votes compared with Dutton's 35. But here's the thing. According to 3 different sources, Morrison secretly stacked the vote for Dutton, but just like he did with Abbott, kept his own hands clean. According to Nakia Sava, a writer for The Australian who then of course had access to Dutton's faction, Dutton told her that he believed that Morrison's guys voted for him in the first ballot. On top of this, ex-Liberal MP Craig Laundy said that 10 of ScoMo's guys voted for Dutton. One of them, Lucy Wicks, has publicly acknowledged doing as such. And then Turnbull himself said that Alex Hawke, Morrison's famous right-hand man, had organised 12 votes to go to Dutton and had long kept a file of everyone's allegiances on his laptop. Morrison claims that as far as he knows, everyone voted for Turnbull. As pressure continued to grow on Turnbull, he held a press conference with Morrison, where Morrison was asked if he'd challenge for leadership. Morrison then claimed, "Who? Me? This is my leader and I'm ambitious for him." Ultimately, despite Turnbull's compromise, the pressure didn't relent. One of his key allies, Matthias Cormann, flipped to be in favour of the spill, and Turnbull had lost the numbers and resigned, announcing he wouldn't challenge for the leadership. This then opened the door for a 3-horse race: Morrison, Dutton, and Julie Bishop. Bishop got pumped in the first round as the votes went 36 for Morrison, 40 for Dutton, and then 11 for Bishop. However, this pretty much guaranteed a Morrison victory, as only 2 of Bishop's supporters then went for Dutton, with Morrison emerging victorious 45 to 40 in the second ballot. Turnbull's last act was to cast his vote for Morrison, but in reality, he'd been done by the same trick they'd used against Abbott. As ScoMo gave his press conference, a lot of people were using the Steve Bradbury meme of everyone falling over in front of him at the finish line. And that's exactly what Morrison wanted everyone to believe. I'll finish with a text that Malcolm Turnbull sent to Cormann after the spill. This is one he seems proud of in his book. "Matthias, at a time when strength and loyalty were called for, you were weak and treacherous. You should be ashamed of yourself, and I well understand how disappointed your wife is in your conduct." But did you know that there was another Liberal leader called Malcolm? Malcolm Fraser actually came to power in the craziest of circumstances, as he was literally installed by the Governor General after he fired Gough Whitlam. Except that guy's not Malcolm Fraser. He's William McMahon. If you didn't know that, click here to learn about Malcolm Fraser.